Today's daf is daf Samach Ches, and we're going to begin with Omar Chizkiah on the third line from the top. And the Gemara is deriving from Achos Isha and the equation of all Arayas in the Parsha of Arayas in Vayikra Perek Tezvav, that just like in Achos Isha, as a paradigm of an erva, there's no tfisas kiddushin, so too there's no tfisas kiddushin in all arayos. And now the problem is, well, what about a nida? A nida is a chiv kares, also included in the parsha of arayos. Should we not include a nida in that equation, and therefore ein kiddushin tovsim b'nida? And Chizkiah responds to that question, to that challenge, by saying, Omar kra utehi nidasa alav. And the word tehi is always indicative of marriage, of ishus, of havaya. And afil b'shas nidasa tehi ba havaya. So there's tfisas kiddushin in a nida. So with regard to nida, the Torah goes out of its way to teach us that kiddushin atovsim b'nida. With regard to Achos Isha, the Torah is outspoken about the fact that there's no Tfisas Kiddushin. And now we don't know what to do with Shar Arayos, the balance of Arayos. Should we compare them to Nida, and therefore there would be Tfisas Kiddushin, or should we compare them to Achos Isha, and therefore there's no Tfisas Kiddushin? Michdi. Gemara asks the following question, Ikal Akusha L'Nida, we could suggest that Shar Arayos should be equated to Nida. The Ika, we have another possibility of lakusha lachos isha. And the Gemara asks the obvious question, my chazis the mikshas lehu lachos isha akshal nida. And the Gemara now formulates a klal, a principle that applies to the laws of hekesh. If you have a hekesh and it could go two ways, then the rule is l'kul l'chumra makshinon. When we have ambiguity and we're not sure which way to derive the hekesh, we always derive it l'chumra. So instead of saying that the shar arayos are less chamur than achos isha, and they're on the lower level of nida l'kula, and therefore there would be tfisas kedushin, we're going to say the exact opposite, l'chumra makshinon, and therefore we're going to make a hekesh between shar arayos and achos isha, to teach you that just like Achos Isha, there's no Tfisas Kiddushin because of the Chumas HaAvera, so too, in the case of Shar Arayos, there's no Tfisas Kiddushin. Now, the Gemara had earlier touched on the issue of just one second. Of Baal Asota. Right, the Torah says that after Kini and Stira, the husband and the wife are not allowed to have relations. And that's an Isur Lav. So perhaps we should say there too, there's no Tfisas Kiddushin. So that would depend upon the Machlokas Rabbi Kiva and the Chachamim in Chayvei Lavin. But it could be that in the case of a sota, where the husband has a relationship with the sota and violates the lav, and it's chayvei lavim, the reason why the vlad of such a relationship would not be a mamzer is because even though in all other chayvei lavim, according to Rabbi Kiva, there's no tfisas kiddushin, nevertheless, in the case of sota, there is tfisas kiddushin, haraya, Rashi says, because they still remain married, meaning he didn't give her a get. If somebody would have a relationship with his sota, he would be chayv misal eshes ish. So we see there that there is tfisas kiddushin, and the ishus is a valid reality, and therefore the child of such a relation would not be a mamzer. And Tosas Divra Maskil Hakol writes that based on a Gemara in Yevamis Pehayim and Beis, not only is the Kiddushin between the Baal and his wife, the Sota, still intact and valid, and it's not Paka, even if he would divorce her and then remarry her, he would create a Tfisas Kiddushin, even though he's not allowed to have a relation with her insofar as she's a Sota, and there's a separate Isolav for him to have a relation with his wife who's a Sota. So even when he remarries her, there will be Tfisas Kiddushin, but yet the Vlad would not be a Mamzer. And getting back to Nida, once again, there is Tfisas Kiddushin in a Nida, and the Vlad is not a Mamzer. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Omar, he has another alternative answer to derive that all arayas, there's no Tfisas Kiddushin. And that's a Kal V'chomer from Yevama. Uma Yevama shehi belav lo tafsi ba Kiddushin. This is based on the pasuk in Parshas Ki Teitze. It says lo sia eishes hameis achutz lishzar, that with regard to Yevama, who has a zikas yibum, and there's an Isur of Yevama l'shuk as a lav, but the Torah says that even though it's only a lav, and there's no chiv kares, lo sia. And as we said earlier, the word sia is indicative of ishus, of havaya, and there's no sia in the case of a Yevama l'shuk, even though it's only a chiv lav without a chiv kares. So therefore, the Gemara says, in the name of Rav Acha bar Yaakov, we could have now Kal V'chomer, Chayve Mises, V'chayve Krisus, Lo Kolshke. If the Torah says Lo Sia with regard to Yevama, that if a man other than the Yavam would have Kiddushin with her, there's no Tfisas Kiddushin, which is the drasha of Rav and Masechet Yevamos Daf Yud Gimel Mid Beis. There's no Avaya, no Tfisas Kiddushin in Yevama, and Yevama is only allowed, and how much more so in an Avera Chamura like a Karis or a Mrs. Bezdin, there would not be Tfisas Kiddushin. In fact, the Gemara, Yihachi, Shar Chayve Lavim Nami. What about other Chayve Lavim? Why don't we derive the conclusion that there's no Tfisas Kiddushin in general in Chayve Lavim? And we'll derive it from a Hekesh to Yevama. That just like in Yevama, Lishuk, there's no Tfisas Kiddushin because the Torah says Lo Sia. Let's extrapolate and equate by analogy all Chayve Lav. Like, for example, Almona L'Kohen Gadol, or a Grusha V'Zona V'Chalol L'Kohen Hedjod. In all these cases, Nami, we should derive from Yevama that there's no Tfisas Kiddushin. And even though it's not a Kal V'chomer, because, the other Lavim are on the same level as Yevama L'Shuk, they're all Lavim, but nevertheless, we have another method of deriving halachas, which is called a Bameh Matzinu. And Bameh Matzinu means that Kishem Shematzinu B'Yevama, who has an Isur Lav, there's no Tfisas Kiddushin because of the Pasuk Lo Sia. So too, other Isurei Lavim, the examples we gave before, there would be no Tfisas Kiddushin. Amar Av Papa Chayve Lavim Behedjek Sivbo. With regard to Yevama, that there's no Tfisas Kiddushin, we're not going to derive other lavim because the Torah went out of its way in Yevama to tell you that there's no Tfisas Kiddushin. But what about Shar Lavim? So we have the parsha, says Rav Papa, which is in Ki Teitze that follows the parsha of Eishes Yifas Torah. Afterwards it says Ki sienu le'ish shtei nashim achas ahuva v'achas nua. So the Torah requires that he marry the Eishes Yifas Torah, and she becomes a snua. And now he has two wives, one's ahuva, one's snua. Now each one has a child, a son, and the bechar was born to the snua. And the Torah goes out of its way to say that in such a case, if the bechar is from the snua, then lo yuchal levakeres ben ha'ahuv al pnei ben hasnua bechar, meaning that the bechar is going to inherit a double portion pishnayim, even though he's the son of the isha snua. And Rav Papa darshans from this pasuk v'chi yesh snua lefnei hamakom ahuv lefnei hamakom. Why did the Torah have to describe one woman as a snua and the other as ahuva? Is it that in the eyes of the Torah one is beloved and one is loathed? it's pashut without even a shadow of a doubt that in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's no such thing as an ahuva or a snua. And not only that, but why should there be any havamina, any impact on the laws of Yerusha based on ahuva and snua? Ella, but rather ahuva means ahuva binisuel. In other words, it was an illegitimate marriage. I'm sorry, ahuva means it was a legitimate marriage. Snua binisuel is an illegitimate marriage. In other words, the marriage was a violation of an isur lav. And the Gemara understands that this snua is an allusion to Nashim Asurus B'Lav. Later on, the Gemara is going to ask, well, maybe the pasuk is referring to something even less than a lav, and she's a snua b'nesuah based on an isur essay, like, for example, Mitri and Adomi. Okay, we'll get to that later on. That there is tfisas Kiddushin. So we have here a snua, and we're saying that a snua b'nesuah means that there was a violation of an isur lav, and that ishus is snua l'fnei Hashem, and nevertheless the Torah says that ki siyena li'ish shtei nashim, that he's married to both of them, even the snua, which means that there's tfisas Kiddushin in chayvei lav. Gemara goes on. After all, Rabbi Akiva would say that any violation of chayvei lavim, even though there's no chiv kares, nevertheless there's no tfisas Kiddushin, and the vlad is a mamzer. So what is he going to do with this pasuk referring to a snua, which we said is a violation of a lav, and yet the Torah says ki siena, that he's married to both these women, gam the ahuv and gam the snua, and yet according to Rabbi Akiva there's no tfisas Kiddushin in a snua that's chayvei lavim. What's he going to do with the pasuk ki siena? And the Gemara answers, "Be'almana lekohen gadol ukarav simoy." So now we get to a whole machlokas here between Rav Simoy and Rav Yeshevev about how to understand Rabbi Akiva. According to the shita of Rav Simoy, Rabbi Akiva concedes that in the case of almana lekohen gadol, there is tfisas Kiddushin, even though it's a violation of a lav, and the nesuin here between the almana and the kohen gadol is an illegitimate nesuin. Desanya Rabbi Simoy Omer min hakol hay Rabbi Akiva osa mamzer. In other words, in every violation of a biasura, the vlad that results from that biasura is a mamzer chutz, with the exception of the almana lekohen gadol. That even though almana lekohen gadol is a violation of a lav, nevertheless we're to derive from a special drasha that the child is not a mamzer. Hare Omer Torah, the Torah says, Lo yechalel zaro bi'amav. And this is a reference to the Kohen Gadol who marries an almana, and he's being mechalel his zera. Now, chalolis is much less severe than mamzeris. Mamzeris is a psul kol, you can't marry anyone in the kol. A chalolis status is only relevant to kohanim. And we're going to darshan from the pasuk, "V'lo yechalel zaro" means chilulim uoseh. The Torah warns the Kohen Gadol not to marry an almana because he's being mechalel his zera, and the zera from that relation of an almana to Kohen Gadol will be a chalal, but ein oseh mamzeris, from the fact that the Torah limits the psul here to a psul kehuna and does not extend it to a psul kol. We know now that there will be tfisas Kiddushin in almana lekohen gadol. There would be no mamzeris from this relationship, even according to Rabbi Akiva. So now we have an answer to our original question, that what is Rabbi Akiva going to do with the pasuk ki siyena, and one of the two women of ki siyena is a snua, which we said is chayvei lavim. We can interpret it as a reference to almana lekohen gadol. And even though Rabbi Akiva, as a general rule, says that in a violation of lavim there's no tfis Kiddushin, the exception is almana lekohen gadol, based on the drosh of lo yechalel chilul mooseh v'eno oseh mamzerus. And therefore, when we get back to the pasuk ki siyena, referring to the snua as well as the ahuva, it means that in the case of almana lekohen gadol there is tfisas Kiddushin and there's no mamzerus. Frekta Gemara, that works out very nicely according to Rav Simoi's interpretation of Rabbi Akiva. But what about Rav Yeshevev? The Omar, he comments about the din of Rabbi Akiva. Bo v'nitzavach al Akiva ben Yosef shaya omer kol she'ein lo bia b'Yisrael avlad mamzer. According to the transmission of Rabbi Yeshevev, Rabbi Akiva went very far. And he said that any time there's no bia, meaning any illegitimate relationship, is going to generate mamzerus. And therefore, it comes out that according to Rabbi Yeshevev, within Rabbi Akiva, even the son of an almana l'kohen gadol would be a mamzer, because it's a bia asura, and kol she'ein bia b'Yisrael avlad mamzer. So we can't answer that the snua is a snua bin Isuel, which is an almana l'kohen gadol, because even in that case, there's no tfisis kiddushin. The vlad is a mamzer, according to Rabbi Akiva, and we don't know how to interpret the pasuk Kisiena when there's no tfisis kiddushin. The Gemara says, wait a minute. How do we understand Rav Yeshevev? There are two ways of understanding Rav Yeshevev. Hanicha, I could answer your question if le Rabbi Yeshevev ilafukim and Rav Simoy kasi shapit. If, and this is one possible approach to understanding Rav Yeshevev, he's coming to exclude Rav Simoy, to be cholik on Rav Simoy's interpretation of Rabbi Akiva, according to which the vlad of an almana shenises the kohen gadol is not a mamzer, and comes along Rabbi Yeshevev says nan, that according to Rabbi Akiva that's not so, and the vlad of a kohen gadol shenises le almana would be a mamzer, but Rabbi Yeshevev would be moded that if you go down one level below an Isur Lav, because Almana l'Kohen Gadol is an Isur Lav, and that's why, according to Rabbi Yeshevev, Rabbi Akiva would say that the Vlad is mamzer from a relationship between the Kohen Gadol and an Almana. But what do we do with the Pasuk Kisiena? That's a snua, but on a lower level than a Lav. What could be lower than a Lav? That's an essay. Where do we have an essay? In the case of Mitzri or Adomi, where the Torah commands you to marry them after 3 generations. So there's an Isur essay. Is Shapir, and then we understand that the word Snua in the Torah is referring to a Mitzri or an Adomi, which is an Isur essay. And that's why Kiddushin Atovsin Bo. And now we have a Pshat that's very solid for Kisiena, according to Rabbi Akiva. But if we take another interpretation of Rabbi Yeshevev, and Rav Yeshevev was not simply arguing with Rav Simoy, but we should take it as a separate, independent ruling of Rav Yeshevev, Taima Denafshei Ka'omar. And he says this klal of Kol Shein Lo Bia B'Yisrael, he's saying it that according to his understanding of Rabbi Akiva, there's a klal, and anytime the bia is a bia asura, then the product of such a relationship is a mamzer. And even in the case of Mitzri and Adomi, is then b'may mukile. We don't have any possible interpretation of the word snua where the Torah says ki siena that Kiddushin atovsin bo. And the Gemara answers b'bu'ula kohen gadol. Again, we're talking about a woman who was never married, and therefore there's no Isur of almana, but she cannot marry the kohen gadol, because the Torah commands the Kohen Gadol, Isha b'psula yikach, and she's not a b'sula, she's a ba'ula. So a Kohen Gadol who marries a ba'ula violates the essay of who Isha b'psula yikach. So Gemara says, Umayshna. Why is the Isra essay of ba'ula Kohen Gadol that Kiddushin Atovsba different than every other case of Chayve essay, which is called Shein Bia b'Yisrael? Mishum dehavile essay shein shavah b'kol. There's only one person on the face of the earth who is enjoined from marrying a ba'ula, and that's the Kohen Gadol. And therefore, the scope of the lav, I shouldn't say the lav, I'm sorry, the essay, is very, very limited. And therefore, that makes it into an Isur Kal. And if it's an Isur Kal, that's why Kiddushin Atovsim. V'Rabbanan, the Rabbanan who are of the opinion that we don't derive from Yevama that Ein Kiddushin Tovsim B'Chayve Lavim, they rejected that drasha, that derivation. They interpret Kisiena to teach us that Kiddushin atofsim b'chayve lavin is ad muki love b'chayve lavin nukum b'chayve ese. This is the question that we hinted at before. Why should we say that the pasuk of Kisiyena is limited to chayve lavim to tell you that, I'm sorry, is applicable, I should say, to chayve lavim, that in chayve lavim there is tfisas Kiddushin Kisiyena miloshen avaya tfisas Kiddushin? Maybe the pasuk is not referring to chayve lavim. Maybe the snua here is chayve ese, meaning a marriage to a mitzri or an adomi is nukvi b'chayve ese, and only noshim who are prohibited be ese, then Kiddushin tofsim. But in chayve lavim, let's derive from Yevama, which is a lav, a losia, eish sameis achutz lishzar, that ein Kiddushin tofsim ba. So the Gemara answers that the Rabbanan hold that it's impossible to interpret the pasuk of isha snua, achas snua, as referring to a case of a violation of an essay. Dahani chayve essay ma'ininu. What could it be that there's an Isser essay over here? Shteim mitzrios. If both the ahuva and the snua are mitzrios, and there's an Isser to marry a mitzris or an adomis, is then shteim nesuos. The Gemara is operating with the assumption that kisiyeno leish shtei nashim, both are the same. So therefore both fit into the category of mitzrios, or perhaps adomios. Ishneim shtein snuos. So how can you tell me that one is ahuv and one is snu if they're both from a different race, a different nation, namely Mitzrim? V'yachas mitzris, v'yachas Yisraelis. Maybe you'll tell me he married two women. One is a snua bin Isuel, and that's the mitzris. The other is the Israelis, she's ahuva bin Isuel. But the pasuk says kisiyeno leish shtei nashim. What does that imply? Tam echad be'inon. There's one underlying reason for the problematic marriage, and the child that's born from this marriage is a common to both women. Kisiyeno leish shtei nashim. Tam echad be'inon. So therefore, when you want to interpret that the ahuva is the Israelis, whereas the snua is a mitzvahs, then you violated that principle of tam echad be'inon. Ve'i ba'ula kohen gadol. And if you'll tell me the snua is referring to a ba'ula that got married to a kohen gadol, is then that interpretation only belongs exclusively to kohen gadol. Umik siv tiena lekohen. It says ki siena leish. It would seem that this parsha applies even to Yisrael, lav dafka to a kohen. And therefore, the Rabbanan understood that the meaning of the Torah, the intention of the Torah, was that snua would be a woman who is asura al baila be'isalah. And yet the Torah says ki siena to teach me that there is Kiddushin tofsin b'chayve lamen. But from the din of Yevama that ain't Kiddushin tofsim ba, we're going to derive only that ain't Kiddushin tofsim b'noshim that are asuras b'kares or b'misas bezdin. So the Gemara asks, Rabbi Akiva bal korche shavke lekra dahavi dochik umukia nafsha. The Gemara wants to know, how would Rabbi Akiva interpret the pasuk? We're going according to Rav Yeshovim, referring to chayve essay. That's dochak to say that the pasuk is referring to chayve essay. Give me a second here. I apologize. So the Gemara is saying that muchrach, we have to assume bidochak to accept that interpretation. In other words, once the Torah taught us in Yevama that ein Kiddushin tofsim chayve lavim, then when the pasuk says kisiyenu referring to achas snua, we have no choice but to assume it's a mitzris or an adomis or a ba'ul kohen gadol that are only at Yisrael Esed. So again, that's not the simple pshat in the pasuk, admittedly, but once the Torah in Yevom has taught me that if there's chayve lav, there's no tvis Kiddushin, then what do I do with Kisiena? I have no other option. My back is against the wall other than to interpret that Kisiena leish with the snua is referring to chayve esed. The Mishnah says, "Kol misha ein lo olav v'lo alacherim Kiddushin is avlad kimosa." And what is this case? The Mishnah spells out Vlad Shivcha V'Nachris, because again, Ein lo olav lo acherim Kiddushin. No one could generate Kiddushin with a Shivcha Knainis or with a Nachris. And the Vlad that's married, that's born of a marriage relationship between a Yisrael, a Jewish man, and a non-Jewish woman, or a Shivcha, is going to be Kimosa, has the same status. He's an Eved if he's a male, a Shivcha if she's a female, and that's called Havlad Kimosa. So B'Shivcha Knais Minolan, what's the source from which we derive that a Jewish man who has a relationship with a Shivcha Knais, the child is an Eved, which is called Vlad Shivcha Havlad Kimosa. Amar Rav Huna Amar Kra, the Torah says in the parasha of the Akedah, at the end of Vayera, it says, Vayomar Rav Hama Lanor, Shvu lachem pam hachamar, am hadom el chamar. So the reference, the allusion here is to Eliezer, the Eved Knani of Avram, and Avram says to him, you sit here. Rav Soloveitchik has a very dramatic interpretation of this Shvu lachem pam hachamar. And that is that Amadom el Chamor, you can't have Tfisas Kiddushin with an animal, so too you can't have Tfis Kiddushin with a non-Jew, or in this case, with a Shivcha Knanis. And the Gemara says, okay, Ashkechan de lo tafsi be Kiddushin, but we went way beyond that. And we wanted to establish that the Vlad is Kimosa. How do we know that?